Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Michael Zuber, one rental at a time, back with the CEO of Hemlane, Dana. How you doing, Dana?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on this Thursday morning.
Absolutely. We're going to put you on the spot. We're going to ask you to go back in time, and I want to just ask questions. I've never started a company. I've never had the vision, never had the drive. It's hard, I'm sure. You're taking inordinate amount of risk. You have no idea what you're going to do. So I want to go back to the very beginning, before you probably even had a name.
Yeah.
What inspired you to say, I see a problem, I think we can fix it, I want to go create a company and really take this challenge down? Because again, it's unique. Not a lot of people think, but not a lot of people do. And you've brought it a long way. But go back to the very beginning. What happened?
Yeah. And I do think you've started a business. So I wouldn't put yourself not in those shoes, especially with one rental at a time, as well as with your own real estate investments. It's going into and diving into entrepreneurship for like building a company is very similar actually to building a real estate portfolio.
Okay.
A lot of people have the idea of it and dream about doing it. And you see it in these meetup groups. There's a lot of people that go, and I'll ask a question of like, do you invest in real estate? Oh, not yet, but I'm going to get into it. It's this whole execution factor where you just have to dive into the deep end. And the question is, when do you dive into the deep end? Because a lot of people have ideas, a lot of those never go into fruition. And I've seen actually in Silicon Valley, a lot of folks who have ideas and are like, oh, I don't want to tell people my ideas because I don't want them stolen. Yeah. And I'm like, ideas are cheap and your idea is going to change over time. And I actually do remember this when I was at Apple, Steve was had said in one of his talks that it's like you have all these puzzle pieces, but putting them together is actually the difficult part. And so even though we knew there was a problem, we didn't know the solution. And the solution we came up with was actually not the solution we started with. We just continued to listen to customers.
Awesome.
And we had to change things constantly. And so, there's no right, like I won't tell, every business is built differently. I won't be able to tell you at this time you quit your job and you start a company. But I do think you are right. It's someone's ability to take risk and like how willing are you to dive into the deep end, just like with real estate, how much are you willing to give up? That's going to change your decision on that spectrum of like, at what point do you dive in and do it? I was when I started Hemlane, it's actually a fascinating story. My co-founder had come to me through a really good friend who's a real estate investor, Thomas. And the three of us had worked on kind of a cash flow business of background and credit checks, because back then there weren't tools out there. Like Cozy was just starting as well. And so we were doing free background and credit checks for landlords because we had all had that problem of like, things aren't screened well. We wanted more transparency. And so we had started with that. And the more I worked with Frank, who's my co-founder today, the more I realized, wow, this is like a really special relationship. Everything that I lack, he's very highly technical and he pushes the limit. I would say this is impossible to do. And he's like, oh no, it's not.
No, give me a weekend.
He's like, I can prove it. I can prove it through technology. So he had a lot of these skills that I didn't have. There's always, when you start a company, like one point in time where you have to make a really big decision. And so for me, it was, I was in business school. And so I was on the East Coast and I'd written a paper and it was actually super easy to write. It was for design and innovation. And it was basically about remote property management and how I was living remote and my family had investments in Denver and I was starting to manage them. And there was this whole, hey, I'm in a different place. This is going to continue to happen as more people travel. It's easier to invest in other places and realize, hey, there's this whole concept of remote management. And I related it a lot when I was in business school. I was actually working at Nest, the home technology company. So I related it back to there. It's like, from my phone, I can change my thermostat. Why can't I have it where everything with the tenants can be right there on my phone in one space? And, it's smart enough to know when there are turnovers and what needs to happen. So anyways, wrote this paper.
What year is this? Sorry, roughly?
It was 2015.
Okay.
2015.
All right.
And the professor, actually, ironically enough, he actually now is the dean of Harvard Business School.
Oh.
But back then he was just the professor. And he had given me, and I worked with a couple of other students, but it was the idea that I had said, hey, team, we should work on this. He gave us the top grade. He goes, you know what, you really need to consider building this. This was really thoughtful. And, you know, you really know this subject pretty well. And then at the same time, Frank, my co-founder, was back here helping kind of build these tools. And we started talking about, like, how do we do something bigger? How do we actually take that paper and then actually bring it into real life? And so then another professor I had, I said, hey, can I do a side project on this with Frank? And so we started talking about the idea, and we did it for like a class. And so then this 2015.
Okay.
And the defining moment was I had offers to go back to Apple and to Nest, which was then part of Google. So I was broke at this point. Like, by the way, my bank account was at zero. I spent anything I'd made on Apple stock. I sold it way too early. It was a terrible decision. Sold it way too early, and spent it all to pay for business school. So my bank account was literally at zero. And so going back to Apple Nest was like, oh, that would be the smart thing to do. Like, I literally couldn't even pay rent.
Wow.
And that professor had said, Dina, you graduate on Saturday, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay, we'll come into my office on Sunday morning. Okay, sounds good. So I go into his office and he says to me, are you going to go back to Apple or Nest? And he had seen I was working in the iLab like Friday night, Saturday night on this. And he said, are you going to go back to Apple and Nest? And I said, probably not. You know, Frank and I are talking about actually building what is now Hemling. We didn't have the name. And so I said, I think I'm actually just going to start building this, and we'll just see where it goes. And he goes, okay, great. Here's a check to help you get there.
Wow.
And our first angel check, and it was $30,000. And for 2015, Frank and I lived off 2015 to 2016. Frank and I lived off that $30,000 check. That's all we had. And that's literally all we had. So, I mean, I sold my car, I sold everything. I lived in a 400 square foot apartment, tiny. My husband, because he was my fiance at the time, was paying the rent for us because I couldn't pay it. And then we built it from there. So I think there's those defining moments in your life of like, do I go one pathway or another? And you kind of figure out when those are. And don't get me wrong, like when we started Hemling, there were times in that first year where I was like, I can't do this. Like, this is too much. I'm working these investment banking hours. There's so much risk here. Now in hindsight, it seems stupid to have considered to go back to a company and not innovate. That's awesome. That's anyways a long story of it.
No, that's awesome. The one question I have to kind of wrap up this episode, because we're going to ask in episode 2 where you're taking this thing that's now amazing. Maybe even before you went to business school, would you have considered yourself, kind of self-reflection, did you always have this entrepreneur streak? Did the business school uncover it? Who was Dana before business school? Were you just a great employee and then something happened? Or when you look back, were you always an entrepreneur just in hiding?
Yeah, I don't think I was always an entrepreneur. I was a really good employee. Like if you, Michael, had asked me, and this would happen at Apple or Nest, if you had asked me, hey, Dean, I have an analysis, and you tell me that on like 6 p.m. on Friday night, I would cancel my Friday night plans just to make sure I got it to that night. And I'd be like, great, Michael, I'm on top of it. Don't worry, you'll have this. And so I was a really good employee in the sense I just worked really hard. And I ask questions. I think the only thing, and that's where entrepreneurs are different. Like I'm much more like of an execution, learn by doing, talking to customer type entrepreneur. There's others that are much more visionary, where I've seen some cannot execute at all, but they're very visionary and they get a team behind them that executes. And so what I've learned is every entrepreneur is a little bit different.
Interesting.
And for me, it was the idea that really pushed and moved me in that direction. One thing I would say is I always asked why. Anytime we were doing something, I was like, well, why do we do it this way? Why do we send out this report? Why are we using these tools? And I think maybe that kind of was sort of an entrepreneurial type trait. But I'd say, like, if you're looking at yourself and you work, you know, a 9 to 5 at a large corporation, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not an entrepreneur. You can be, but you obviously need the right team, just like you do in real estate, and an idea that you're really passionate about that you'll go through. And if you haven't worked at a startup, like I do wish I'd worked at a startup first, it's going to take you longer to grow and scale it, in part because there's a lot of things in the corporate world that are just almost easy that you don't think about, or you only see one lens of the business.
Right.
If you work for a startup that's like 5 to 10 people, you're doing everything. And so I think it's much easier for you to launch and get things started.
Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to ask you about, I don't think it's, you know, I think it's obvious, at least in the Silicon Valley, a lot of startups are kind of male dominated, at least maybe I don't see it. I don't know. But I want to, if there are, I think there's a lot of great visionary women that could start companies that maybe don't. Is there, you know, something you recommend, or an organization that you'd recommend that people look into? Because I think we need more visionaries, and I think frankly, it's too male dominated, kind of one sided.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it definitely is. And the stats show that female founded companies actually do better, right, over time. And I think it is because women are very pragmatic of, like, when I give a forecast number, it's like, well, how are you going to get there? It's like, oh, well, here's exactly how I get there. Whereas sometimes I've seen men in real estate, like prop tech, who are like, I'm going to be at $1 billion in 2 years. And it's like, well, how are you going to get there?
I'm gonna, it's just, they repeat it louder. I'm like, okay, great.
Exactly. I mean, actually the Kraken crypto, so the Kraken CEO is great at that. When they say, where are you going next? Like, I think he was on the news the other day and he goes, we're going to Mars. And it's like, well, how are you going to get to Mars? Like, how do you?
Yeah. No, I'm going to go to Mars. Okay, great. You said that already. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that most of your success as a woman will be your partners and who you surround yourself with. And so what I mean by that is, like, for example, my husband was now husband, he was my fiance at the time, incredibly supportive of me doing it. And that worked to my advantage because he was the one who was like, you've got this. Even in the early days, it doesn't happen so much anymore because, you know, when you're a woman in real estate, prop tech, everyone knows you. Like, they come up to you, they're like, hi, Dana. And you're like, what's that VC's name? I can't even remember, because there's so few of me, but so many of the like white male VC that, like, I just can't remember. Right. But in the early days, you know, you get a lot of no's, and it really builds tough, thick skin. And so through that, and hearing all of those no's, it was really good to have a team around me, like my husband and like my co-founder, who's like, okay, yeah, those VCs just invested in one of our competitors, and we cannot wait to see that company crash in a year. And, like, sure enough, it would. And, like, you know, so it was really the people around me, I think, that really helped drive things forward and helped get us to the next stage. And that's where I do think you need a partner who's supportive. I've seen on the flip side some where partners are like, why don't you just give up and go back to, you know, Apple, and you'll make more money, and it's going to be an easier, you know, 9 to 5, depending on what group you're in. But you really need a team behind you of people who say, I believe in you. And I've been very fortunate to have that. I also look up to women who are founders and kind of see what they do and their path and their voice and things like that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the people. It's like, how can you organically build a relationship and find a co-founder? It is really hard if you are a single, like a female entrepreneur, and you're a sole founder, whether you're a male or a female, your chances of succeeding are significantly lower. I think it's like 50% fewer of those succeed. And so you really want to build a team around you. Even if you're the voice of the company, you want to build a team around you that believes in you.
That's great advice. I love to see what you've done so far. I remember having our very first phone call way back when, before there was really a lick of code written. So Dana, this has been a lot of fun. Round 2, we're going to talk about where this thing's going, because it's going to be a
Right?
fun journey. Thanks, Dana.
Awesome.
Mhm.